This is Duke University.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar, Market Mechanisms 101, Possible Applications under the Clean Power Plan. I'm Jeremy Tarr, Policy Counsel in the Climate and Energy Program here at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Presenting today is Dr. Brian Murray, the Director of Economic Analysis here. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the Nicholas Institute, we are a research institute located on the campus of Duke University, and we provide economic, legal, and policy analysis to decision makers at the state and federal level on a range of environmental issues. We span the academic and policy worlds, and we draw upon analysis from in-house experts as well as the broader resources across the university in order to provide objective information to decision makers and a timeline that's helpful to them. The idea for this particular webinar arose from recent meetings and conversations where many state officials expressed an interest in learning more about market mechanisms. So we hope you will use this as an opportunity to ask any questions you may have about markets. Brian Murray is the director for the Environmental Economics Program at the Nicholas Institute. I think few people understand environmental markets better than Brian. He's been involved in the early stages of development for many such markets and has advised numerous state officials in balancing concerns about price spikes while also ensuring the environmental integrity of the system. His work extends well beyond emission markets, but we're very fortunate to have him as part of our team on our southeastern work with the Clean Power Plan. Brian, thanks for being here and agreeing to present today.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thanks to all of you for participating this afternoon. I know you're busy with work, you're busy thinking about the Clean Power Plan rule, and maybe you're even busy trying to get some Christmas shopping done. This webinar is in response to a request from you, from the participants in the Southeastern States process, who during some of our other engagements with you have indicated that you'd like to learn more about how a market-based system could possibly work within the region, just so you can evaluate your plans for implementing 111D at the state level. This talk, nor anything that we really do here, is intended as a proposal of any particular policy or advocating any particular type of position. Rather, it's providing information that you can use to make better decisions. The objective of the webinar will be to convey the basics, the why, the how, the who, and the where of market-based approaches to emissions control with a particular focus on greenhouse gases, and then customized to the circumstances that are confronting you all with the Clean Power Plan rule. So there are lots of precedents to draw from, but our focus here is going to be thinking about the connection between these types of approaches to reducing emissions and your plans for Clean Power Plan rule. So this is nothing new to you on the phone, but it'll be a point of departure for our discussion, which is what is essentially required in the proposed Clean Power Plan rule. First is that each state must meet an emissions goal expressed by the EPA in pounds per megawatt hour for affected existing fossil generation sources. And I won't go through what each of those affected sources are, but it's essentially those that use existing units that use fossil fuels to generate electric power. EPA is also, or was until last week, taking comments on inclusion of new natural gas combined cycle units. For compliance purposes, the rate that has been established is essentially computed as the emissions from the affected existing fossil units plus other fossil emissions divided by the generation from those units plus displaced generation from eligible renewable electricity generating units plus a share of the nuclear fleet that has been deemed to be at risk and therefore continuing operating those units provides sort of an additional basis by which to achieve a lower effective rate of emissions from the state, and then the displacement of generation from energy efficiency. and this rate-based approach can be converted to a mass-based equivalent. And that's very important for the purposes of this discussion today, because we're going to talk about market-based approaches that can be used in either type of system, a rate-based system or a mass-based system, and I will explain how. Okay, so we think about two basic ways that states can achieve the required performance under the Clean Power Plan rule proposal. One approach would be a top-down approach, where regulators can choose amongst a range of compliance options. So, for instance, under the rate-based approach, the state could mandate an emissions rate, a generation mix across the entire fleet, and do so in advance. And do so similarly for energy efficiency programs, where the state would stipulate that a certain amount of energy efficiency displacement will occur and ensure that it does. A mass-based approach would be similar to that, but instead of dealing with rates, it would be dealing with emissions quantities and mandating certain emissions quantities from throughout the fleet. The problem with this type of approach is it's a tremendous amount of information for regulators to try to assert on the system, and would be really at odds with how electricity systems are managed now, which are managed in real time. And then doing this 15 years in advance can be challenging. So as my last comment suggests, real-time adjustments would be needed as power market conditions change. So, for instance, if natural gas prices change, coal prices change, or the availability of lower-cost renewable energy comes to market, having a plan that sort of sets what each individual unit within the state would do in advance would not be of much use. But most important from the sort of the nature of what I'm going to talk about today is that such approach is unlikely to be the most cost-effective solution. And I think I would hazard to say could just about be guaranteed not to be the most cost-effective solution. So another way to achieve this required performance is for the state to provide flexible compliance options. And this could be simply a matter of either averaging rates across the unit subject to the regulation, or aggregating emissions across those units so that they meet an aggregate target. And this would be done in combination with some sort of economic incentive that would support the achievement of the averaging or the aggregating objective. And we can think of that as a more bottom-up approach, because what it does is it devolves the decisions back down to the individual units, which is essentially where decisions are made in this sector to begin with. Okay, so let's go with a quick definition of what we mean by an economic incentive mechanism, and for the purposes of emissions control. So when economists think about economic incentives for emissions control, we think about putting a price on emissions. Now, that can be done one of two ways. One would be to establish a fixed fee, or something like a carbon tax, per unit of emissions that are paid by the regulated sector, and provide an ongoing incentive for those emissions to be reduced, since they will increase the cost. They will also favor lower emitting sources over higher emitting sources, leading to the type of load switching in response to these carbon incentives that one would like to see from an efficiency standpoint. One of the characteristics of such an approach is, if you establish a fee like this, that price will stay fixed, but the emissions performance could vary in response to load demands, in response to the fact that it might be a particularly hot or particularly cold year. So you won't necessarily guarantee the emissions performance. The other basic approach is what we're calling here a market mechanism, which is the trading of emissions credits between parties. And this is really going to be the focus of this discussion today. And I'll explain in more detail what we mean about trading credits between parties and how this creates a market. But in this particular case, in contrast to the tax or fee approach, it's important to understand that the emissions performance is going to be fixed as long as it's enforced adequately at the state level. But the price of these emissions credits will vary in its efforts to achieve this fixed target. So this is a fundamental difference between these two types of approaches. Today, I'm going to focus on the second of these approaches, the market mechanism approach, which is really what you've asked for and which is really what the precedent has been for looking at this within the power sector and other sectors. Now, if any questions, if you, through the question and answer mechanism here, want to ask any questions about what a fee might look like at the state level, I'd be happy to answer those questions. But we're going to move on now to the market mechanism approach. So let's just take a short walk from what we might mean by the state goal that underlies the Clean Power Plant Rule, how we sort of trace our steps from there to a market. So first, if we reestablish that the state goal is to hit either a performance rate or a performance mass target, and then if we allow some flexibility and compliance to achieving those targets, and flexibility in the case of a rate might be averaging across all the affected entities, or flexibility in the case of a mass-based system would be aggregating the emissions across those entities and allowing them to just sum up to whatever the state target is. So if we think about that, and then we move on to the notion of credits. And credits follow naturally from the idea of averaging or aggregating, because in a crediting system, those sources who are lower or zero emitters of carbon dioxide will create credits that can be usable in principle by the high emitting sources. So if you're a high emitting source that's above the target rate or above the target level of emissions, you can use credits from those who are below the target. And as long as the credits balance out, in other words, those that are used for compliance by high emitters are no greater in quantity than those that were generated by the low carbon emitters, you've been compliant with the system, but you've allowed this type of flexibility to occur. And as I'll explain shortly, that type of flexibility can lead to significant reductions in costs, which are the underlying economic rationale for having crediting. Now, crediting can occur within an organization, within a utility, within a firm. Often you might do so using something like transfer pricing. But when we talk about credits going outside the wall of any particular entity, we think of that as a form of trading. So if credits are exchanged with outside parties, presumably you're going to be done with some sort of compensation, so that the higher emitters who need these credits in order to meet compliance obligations are willing to pay the generators of those credits for the right to do so. And it's this exchange between parties where you got buyers and sellers that leads to a market. And this market, if there are enough buyers and sellers in it, will settle on a market price for something like a carbon credit or related zero generation credit that might be able to support achievement of this rule. So this is the step from state goal to flexibility and compliance to the generation of credits to the trading of those credits extramurally to the establishment of market and a market price for these emissions. So I want to go through what I hope is a fairly straightforward example of what the value is by allowing this exchange of credits. So think about two power plants trying to achieve a mass-paced target requiring them somehow together to achieve a 1,000-ton emissions cut. Okay. So if we look on the left side of this screen, we'll see that Plant 1's cost of achieving this emissions cut would be $20,000. Plant 2 can achieve this cut for less, for $10,000. It may be because of the fuel that they use, or it might be because they have less emitting capital. It might be that they have more flexibility in production in terms of timing their generation. Could be a whole bunch of reasons why it is less costly for them to reduce their emissions. But for the purpose of this discussion, it's just important to understand that they can achieve the same emissions reduction less than the first plant. So what that means is you can reduce the cost of achieving this 1,000-ton emission reduction by $10,000, meaning the difference between $20,000 and $10,000, if Plant 2 does the reducing. So that's the lowest cost approach, is to have Plant 2 cut the emissions. Now, if both of these plants were owned by the same company, they would just make it happen, presumably through their dispatch decisions and their bidding into the grid. They would just try to operate Plant 2 more than Plant 1 so that the net result is that they generate 1,000 tons less emissions. However, if they're owned by different companies, how do you create a market incentive to make this happen? So now we're going to move on to the next example, which is, so now think of Plant 1 and Plant 2 negotiating a deal where Plant 1 pays Plant 2 $14,000 to be able to receive 1,000 credits, which they can use to demonstrate that they've achieved a reduction, a compliance reduction. So that means that the low-cost plant actually has to reduce the emissions. The higher-cost plant doesn't have to reduce the emissions, but they have to show that the credits that were generated by the second plant are owned by and can be used by them. So in such, we'll just call that a credit exchange for right now. With the $14,000 credit exchange, then the first plant can reduce their total cost of compliance by $6,000 because it would have cost them $20,000 to reduce their emissions, but they can buy the reductions from Plant 2 for just $14,000. On the other side of this deal, Plant 2 can increase their profit by $4,000 because it only cost them $10,000 to reduce their emissions, but they receive $14,000 for doing so. So this is what economists would refer to as a gain from trade. Each party benefits through this trade, and the system costs are reduced. The system costs are reduced by the full $10,000. It's just the beneficiaries of this reduction are determined by this trade and the terms of trade between the two parties. But the total value to the system is the same. Now, if we move on and we think about, instead of 2 plants, we think about dozens of plants, or possibly even hundreds or more plants out there, all looking for deals like this. Then you start to think of this as a market, just like a market for any other commodity, like a market for the electric power that the utilities generate. And when you have lots of buyers and lots of sellers, then these types of transactions end up settling in a market price, where there's a certain price that is established by the market that all buyers would pay and all sellers would receive. And this market is usually operating in real time, so the price can change from day to day. But at any one point in time, it identifies the terms of trade. So like in this particular example, you would see what happened between Plant 1 and Plant 2 if there was a market price of $14 a ton. You would see that replicated throughout the market. Okay, so that's the basic value proposition of the gains from trade. Now, this is exactly the type of system that we've seen elsewhere in the power sector. First, starting in the mid-1990s through the U.S. Acid Rain Trading Program, where the EPA established caps on emissions of SO2 and NOx at mostly coal-burning power plants, particularly at the beginning, and then it was operated in 2 phases. Now, this has since been superseded by CARE and then the CASPER rule, but the basic point here is that this type of trading has been occurring for close to 2 decades in the electric power sector. Several economic studies have been done and have shown that this has led to substantial cost reductions in terms of meeting those SO2 and NOx targets of 40 to 50% or more through emissions trading than what would have happened under the alternative system, which is typically referred to as a command-based system, much like what I described at the beginning of this discussion. So the relevance for the Clean Power Plant rule is that this provided the earliest experience with emissions trading in the power sector, although for different pollutants, the same sort of basic principles are at work. And so another point is, if we look to the right, we see the map of the power plants that were subject to this rule. power plants in many states have experience with this type of trading mechanism. The other primary example focused just on the electric power sector is the RGGI program, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative operating in the northeastern United States for the last 5 years or so. It's a CO2 emissions trading program in the 9 northeastern states, and it is just applicable to power plant emissions. These states hold a coordinated auction, and tons can be freely traded across all participating states. However, the individual states retain authority over the allowances that are issued and receive all the auction revenues that would occur at the joint auction. These tons trade at a uniform price across the region. It traditionally traded at very low prices because this hit the market right around the same time as the recession and right around the same time that natural gas prices plummeted, making lower carbon emissions more economic to begin with and higher carbon emissions from coal. And so this reduced a lot of the pressure on the prices and led to significant emissions reductions beyond what the cap established for the region. In terms of its relevance for the Clean Power Plant Rule, it can, in principle, be tied to the mass-based Clean Power Plant Rule targets, of course, with adjustments to the current cap, in order for it to match what the mass-based equivalents are at the state level. Such an approach could be expanded to include other states, for instance, or used as an example for other regions to follow with appropriate adjustments for those regional circumstances. So there is experience with this in the power sector. Now, that's sort of the easy case. It gets a little bit more complicated, although I'd like to convince you that it's only complicated when you initially start to think about it, but it can be set up in a fairly straightforward way if you think about how to achieve the rate-based target that might exist at the state level. So I've set up a representative state, state X. And so look, if we look at this table, we think about a plan. And so we think about a state needing to achieve an emissions rate for the Clean Power Plant Rule of 989 pounds per megawatt hour. And that is the state goal. Now, as we described earlier, there's different ways that they can achieve the state goal. For instance, it can be met if the existing fossil units generate at the rate and volume that we show in the table to the left. So, for instance, if the coal plants on average emit 1,900 pounds per megawatt hour, and the gas plants emit on average 775 pounds per megawatt hour, and the generation mix between them is, say, for instance, 40 million megawatt hours and 55 million megawatt hours, then that will average out to a fossil emissions rate for that state of about 1,250 pounds per megawatt hour. Well, that is higher than the target rate, the goal rate for the states established by the CPP. So how are you going to get down to that goal rate of 989? Well, you do so by achieving the 25 million megawatt hours of zero generating sources, in this case RE representing renewable energy, 10 megawatt hours, million megawatt hours, at-risk nuclear generation of 5 million megawatt hours, and energy efficiency displacement of 10 million megawatt hours. If you add those together, and you either make this exact mix happen by mandate and top-down planning, if you add those together, you're going to achieve that state rate of 989. But again, it's a challenge to do this from the top-down planning approach. So what we're going to talk about in the next few slides is how can a market-based mechanism bring this about. Okay, so using this example again, let's think about it this way. So for one thing, is a state could say, okay, so we're going to establish an average rate for all the fossil units in the state to achieve of 1249, using the example to the left. And so within that state, when the gas plants operate, they're going to generate credits of 474 pounds per megawatt hour because they're operating at 474 pounds per megawatt hour below the average fossil rate that is part of the target for the state. On the flip side of that, you've got coal plants will require credits worth 651 pounds per megawatt hour in order for compliance to be met. And so what you can do is you can allow the trading between gas and coal plant units in such a sufficient quantity that the credits that are generated by the gas plants are just what is needed by the coal plants in order to meet the target. And if you have the exact mix that we show on the left, then you are going to hit that rate target, but you will have enabled it by allowing these credits to exchange hands between gas and coal plants. Again, these gas and coal plants could either be within the company or outside of the company, and as we'll talk about in a minute, potentially even outside the state. So that's how you do it at the fossil plants. You still need to generate some sort of credits from these zero generating sources to get the rest of that reduction, to get yourself down to 989 pounds per megawatt hour. And you can do that from a variety of approaches. We could do this by issuing credits. The state could issue credits to these sources, or a market could develop for renewable energy credits, energy efficiency credits, for instance, that could be traded and used by the electricity generating units to meet compliance at the state level. Now, we're going to be talking about in future meetings with you about alternative approaches for where you could put the compliance responsibility in order to most effectively meet these targets, and also to allow some flexibility for averaging or aggregating across state. But I won't go too much into those details right now. Okay, so we do have examples of rate-based performance standards in the power sector as well. We have renewable portfolio standards, which, although are not common within the region, within the Southeast region that most of you are representing, 37 states in the U.S. target either in a mandatory or a voluntary goal-based fashion that a certain percentage of their power be generated by renewable sources. And so they do this by generating RECs, renewable energy certificates. And so every utility that is subject to a REC, to a renewable portfolio standard, has to demonstrate that they have a sufficient number of RECs divided by the total amount of generation that is at least as high as the required rate that they must face for their renewable portfolio standard. So what this means is there's credits being traded around that are denominated in megawatt hours of renewable energy. And so the same basic principle could apply here, although there are some important differences between a renewable energy credit not necessarily used for greenhouse gas compliance purposes and those that wouldn't need to be used for greenhouse gas compliance purposes. Now, again, these can be and have been tradable across companies, and they can be tradable across states. So, for instance, North Carolina utilities can meet part of their renewable portfolio standard by using renewable energy credits that have been purchased from power that was generated in other states, like wind or solar power from other states. And again, the same basic principle could apply here, if so desired. Okay, so the next question you might ask, and this would be relevant for either a mass or a rate-based system, and this is a policy choice that would be left up to the states, was if you do choose to go the trading route, how wide can the trading go? In other words, what scope of trading, what geographic scope of trading would be allowable under the state plan? So at the most basic level, again, you could allow just intra-company averaging to occur. So whether or not a company actually goes to the credit of producing something called a credit, goes to the trouble of producing something called a credit, you know, they could essentially just exchange it in the company so that the coal and the gas units, for instance, have a compliant mix. So that's one way that this could be done. Another way it could be done is to have intercompany trading, but within the state. So all trading occurs and is overseen by an individual state. Now, there are some gains from trade there, as company 2 might have some lower mitigation opportunities that company 3 could purchase and thereby reduce the total cost of the system within the state of achieving that emissions target or emissions rate. Or you can move up and have interstate trading, and this is essentially when the EPA referred to a regional approach, and they looked at it in their regulatory impact analysis. What they did is they modeled a situation in which trading would occur within a region, but only within a region. So you could have all of the states within a predefined region allow trading mechanisms across each other for each state to meet its compliance obligation. They could use credits that were generated in other states. Now, that would be neatly within a region, but you could also imagine that it doesn't have to be just a contiguous region, but you could have trading across states and across regions, across states that are in different regions, and that could, in principle, be enabled here. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you could have essentially interregional trading where all states in the country are part of a broader national trading framework, and even in principle anyway, you could have international trading so that credits generated in the U.S. could potentially be usable in other countries or vice versa. That's not anything that the EPA has really been talking about, but this is sort of a way to sort of complete the thinking in this, on this concept. So I think the important thing to understand about this policy choice, about this decision, is in terms of how wide the trading can go, is that by and large, the wider you spread the net for trading, the larger the scope is for cost reductions. This is, again, the basic gains from trade. You have more mitigation opportunities, and when you have more mitigation opportunities, you have a greater opportunity for cost reduction, because you might, instead of just having one partner to trade with, if you have dozens or hundreds of partners to trade with, your chance of getting a better deal go up exponentially. So expanding the market expands the opportunity for reductions. And as I sort of alluded to in my comments a few minutes ago, this trading doesn't have to be done in this neat hierarchy that's shown in this figure. You could have a state, say within the Southeast, a state or a few states within the Southeast region deciding they want to allow trading with states in other regions. It doesn't have to be contiguous to the region, but there are a lot of advantages to having trading within the region, because you're basically operating in the same power market, and so there's certain economies associated with doing it within the region. But there are still economies that can be gained from trading with other regions as well. So to conclude, I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts here. First, any market-based system has to have some key components that would need to be set up in advance of the system operating to ensure that it operates smoothly, effectively, and with integrity. So the first thing is that states have to agree, basically in principle, and I'm not a lawyer, but I suppose it might take some adjustment. It requires stipulation in state law that states agree to accept credits from different sources, and this would need to be communicated to EPA as part of the proposed plan for the state for EPA's approval. In addition to this agreement, there have to be instruments to trade, whether they're credits or allowances, whether they're expressed in tons, or whether they're expressed in megawatt hours. These instruments are the credits that lead to the cost reduction through either the averaging or the aggregating process that I described earlier. There needs to be some sort of process by which these instruments are registered. in that all instruments used should be officially registered somewhere, and ideally the mechanism you would use is to establish serial numbers that can be authenticated. And this should ensure that that credits don't get used twice, because you're only issuing unique serial numbers, and the serial numbers have to sort of be cleared. And it also allows one to track the chain of custody for these instruments. If, for instance, if as a regulator you might be interested, who is holding these instruments at any one particular point in time, one could know this by going to a registry. But each state doesn't have to set up their own registry. One could deploy registries that are set up at multi-state levels or at any higher level of geographic aggregation, so long as the contributors to the registry are those who plan to use credits that clear through that registry for their compliance purposes. This market-based system would also need trading rules, what's allowed and what's not allowed, and there needs to be some form of compliance enforcement, which presumably is a state obligation. And then this comes back to you then. What are the key choices that you would need to make if such a market-based approach is pursued? First, would have to decide whether whether you're going to develop a mass or a rate-based compliance option. Market mechanisms, as I hope I've convinced you with this presentation, are possible with both types. Then you might want to describe which credits will your state accept. Will you accept only credits that are generated within the state? Will you determine that there are a pre-existing set of states from which you will accept credits, and presumably reciprocally? Or will you just say any state that recognizes credits with the same definition or the same integrity but isn't necessarily stipulated in state legislation, meaning the individual states may not be stipulated, but the conditions of acceptability might be, that is another choice that one could make. Another key choice is whether or not there are configurations besides the states or regions that might make sense for you. One could think of, several of the utilities operating in this region operate across state lines. Does it make sense to align such a trading mechanism along a service territory for these multi-state utilities? Another question, and I alluded to this earlier, and the answer to these questions are complex, and we're going to be talking about them in future engagements with you, but it is important to ultimately understand who's going to hold the compliance responsibility, because this really could affect how the trade works. Will it be held by each EGU within the state, each company or utility that owns multiple EGUs? Will the state itself own the compliance responsibility? Or will it be some sort of combination of the above, sometimes referred to as the portfolio approach? And then another thing is, to what extent can you build off of the existing systems, the registries that exist in other states? There are transactions costs that will be undertaken to allow such trades to occur, but there are also gains from trade. The idea here would be to minimize those transactions costs so that the driving rationale would be other considerations than transactions or administrative costs that make it more or less attractive for your state to consider this or not. So that's all I have in terms of the prepared presentation. That was about 35 minutes, which is about what I had targeted. But now I'm open to any questions that you might have. And again, as Jeremy said, they're going to come through the chat line for him, and he's going to convey them, and I will do my best to answer them.
Thanks, Brian. We have a few questions here already. Again, feel free to use the chat function. So the EPA's goals that it's set in the proposal for each, they vary by state, which means that for that and some other reasons, states have different compliance costs. So, Brian, the question here is why would a state want to participate in an interstate market if it's already a low-cost compliance state, given its state goal under the proposal?
That's a good question, Jeremy. So, I'll start by just pointing out that if you're a low-cost state, your assets will get a higher return if you produce and sell credits to other states, because that is essentially flow of revenues into the state that are sort of returns to the assets within the state. So, so that's a plus for the operators within the states. Now, in some circumstances, this could increase the credit price in the low-cost states, so that looks like that might not be a bad idea for at least some of the emitters within the states. But all in all, the gains to the low-cost sellers should outweigh the losses to the buyers, leaving the state better off in net. And how that's shared, how those gains are shared between the utility itself and its shareholders and the customers is, of course, the purview of the utility commission in states that are regulated. Now, it's hard sometimes to gauge the effect on power prices with a rate-based versus a mass-based approach, because sometimes with the rate-based approach, you can actually see declines in the power prices. And those who are familiar with the EPA regulatory impact analysis will recognize that, and it's because it shifts the dispatch load. And a rate-based approach actually acts as like a marginal subsidy on gas, and if that's your marginal unit, that can actually reduce prices. So it's a little harder to predict what the impact would be on the price, but the overall system costs will clearly go down, both within the state. You know, when you look at the system costs within the state and outside the state, you have more opportunities for cost reduction. And this can actually help the buyers in the low-cost states, too, by participating, because they're buying electrons that are generated from other states as well. So if the whole system costs come down as a result of the trading that occurs between the states, that will feed back directly and indirectly into lower costs in the low-cost state. And one other thing on this point, I want to say, we need to also think of this in dynamic terms. So a low-cost state today, relative to other states, either in the region or in other parts of the country, is not necessarily a low-cost state in the future. And so if a low-cost state sits out of this interstate exchange, this will they could miss out on low-cost breakthroughs that occur in other states. So, for instance, it may look as if compliance would be relatively cheap if a state went alone, because they have sort of better mitigation opportunities. But if, for instance, another state has continued gas breakthroughs, both in terms of price or in terms of the efficiency with which it's converted to electricity, then they might become a lower cost producer than the state that has decided to sit alone, so they'll miss out on those opportunities. Also, renewable generation in other states might become less costly over time through technical change, and if you're shut off to that access to that low-cost mitigation, you'll ultimately drive your cost up relative to what it could be if trading were allowed. So,
yeah. So you've talked about overall benefits to the overall system of markets that one can see, and also that there may even be that there are benefits to low-cost states. There can be benefits to low-cost states in participating in interstate markets. Are there situations where it would be less that would be less conducive to states working together, maybe less advantageous than in other situations?
Well, I mean, I think if certainly if a state is somewhere near what they determine to be the average for the region, there may seem to be sort of less gain from trade with other regions, because the prices will essentially be the same either way, but that would be sort of the exception rather than the rule. What we tend to see, and some of our preliminary modeling in the Southeast shows us as well, is there's some good variation in mitigation costs in the region. So you would expect to see gains from trade from pretty much all parties. There's some low-cost emitters and there's some higher-cost emitters. Mm-hmm. So the real, as I alluded to earlier, the real thing here is, a state has to decide, what's going to be the cost of setting up a system that allows these exchanges to occur, and what are the gains going to be to the state. And if a state does not cooperate with other states or collaborate with other states to bring those transactions costs down, then it may not be worth the trouble of doing the trading. But as I alluded to earlier, there are pretty substantial opportunities to bring some of those transactions costs down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one way you mentioned as a possibility before is maybe building off existing architecture, mm-hmm. such as maybe the REX trading, REX registries already are there, and so building off that might reduce sort of upfront costs or transaction costs of getting the market off the ground. We had a question asking about how robust existing REX markets are. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, they're not so robust in the sense that all 37 states are trading with them super actively to establish a single REC price internationally. But it certainly is the mechanism by which much compliance with the RPS in these states is happening. So in other words, all states, so if you have a state target of 6%, most states who have that target aren't necessarily going to be generating 6% within their own state borders, but they're going to be looking for the cheapest wind, for instance, or the cheapest solar, which often happens in places that aren't being directly regulated for an RPS themselves. And so it's been robust in terms of creating, I think RPS would be much more costly to achieve in states that have them if you couldn't trade across state lines to meet them.
Mm-hmm. Another common question that I've heard when it comes to Clean Power Plan implementation is who holds the compliance obligation. You mentioned this earlier in your presentation, but I wonder if you could sort of speak again to the issue of how, so who could hold the compliance responsibility in a market system, and how might that affect broader electricity system in the Southeast?
Well, I mean, I would think of compliance obligations as being sort of more of a legal question than an economic one, but let's think about two basic approaches. Now, one would be that did everything, and the EPA has talked about this in their technical support documents as well, I believe, is that the responsibility can devolve down to the EGUs, which are, in essence, the regulated source state level. And so that's where the trading between say coal and gas units would occur at the EGU level, but it would also be that the EGUs could be the buyers of renewable energy credits or whatever the sort of corresponding mechanism or instrument would be for them to hit, for lack of a better term, the denominator quantities that are part of the rate. And so you could imagine the EGUs being responsible for not only reporting their emissions at their facility, but demonstrating that they have emissions credits and zero generation credits sufficient to meet the state rate. Again, so then that would be the way it would work in a rate-based system. Of course, with the mass-based system, it's very straightforward in the sense that if the EGUs were the point of compliance, it would simply be a matter, and they would have to be the court. I couldn't really think of a good alternative for them not being the source of compliance. But if they were, then essentially it just becomes they have documentation that shows what their emissions are that year, and then they need to have a commensurate amount of tons of emissions credits to balance those, to create the compliance parity that would be called for.
Mm-hmm. Another question here is along the lines of if a state is considering, say, a go-it-alone approach where it's going to comply without interacting or coordinating with other states, but just through emission reduction strategies that affect itself only, but say neighboring states are planning to cooperate on an interstate basis, are there potential risks or disadvantages that you think the go-it-alone approach state should be aware of and not joining other states?
Well, we've hit on a lot of these, I think, in the question and answer, but I'll try to put a finer point of it. On it. One is, at the risk of redundancy, I think the primary thing is just not having access to the lower cost mitigation across state line. But states can, they can make that judgment on their own. But what it could do is, particularly if they have utilities that are operating in a state that is joined, that allows trading and with other states, and if they choose not to participate in that trading, this could lead to some load shifting across the states that would not otherwise be economic. So basically what this would mean is the marginal cost of reducing emissions in one state is different than it is in another state. So you're going to see redispatching or reloading based in response to that economics. One of the things when you have trading across all these sources is the idea is that the market is going to even out the marginal cost of compliance across the different states. And so EGUs will be able to make more economic decisions about where to dispatch. And that's a sort of a key advantage of a market-based approach, is that what it does is it devolves this emissions constraint into the same types of economic decisions that EGUs and utilities have to make all the time about how much to bid to put power into the market, and how that should reflect the emissions responsibilities for putting that power on the market.
Mm-hmm. We're coming up on the end of the webinar. Want to give folks, if you have a question that you haven't yet communicated, now's the time. Brian, I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but if not, we can go ahead and wrap it up.
Well, I mean, I would just say, you've got my email address right there on the screen that you're looking at right now. I know this isn't necessarily the easiest platform in which to ask questions, but email, if you want to take some time to formulate your thoughts and ask a question, please feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to respond. We'll also, as Jeremy indicated, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to you online, and we can make the PowerPoint slides available as well.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you all for joining the webinar. I hope you found it informative. As Brian mentioned, I'll be in touch with you with the PowerPoint slides and a recording in case you or your staff would like to watch it in the future. And you can also look forward to hearing from me, if you haven't already, about future webinars and meetings, particularly a few that we have planned in January. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to staying in touch with you all.